In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets whisper through ancient stones, 11-year-old Prince George sits alone in his grandfather's study. The weight of a 1,000-year-old crown seems to press down on his young shoulders as he stares at a letter that will change not just his life, but the entire future of the British monarchy. Outside, the world buzzes with speculation about King Charles's revolutionary Royal Review 2026, a bold initiative that promises to reshape the monarchy for a new generation. But, inside this room, something far more profound is happening. A young prince is about to make a choice that no royal child has ever made before, to step forward and speak his truth, to challenge traditions that have stood for centuries, and to prove that even the youngest voice in the House of Windsor can echo through history. The letter in his hands trembles slightly, not from fear, but from the electricity of possibility. It's addressed to his grandfather, the king, and contains words that will either forge a new path for the monarchy or shatter it entirely. As George picks up his pen to add one final line, he doesn't yet know that this moment will be remembered as the turning point when the British royal family truly began to serve the people, rather than simply reign over them. What happens when a child prince decides to rewrite the rules of royalty? What occurs when duty meets authenticity in the most public family on earth? The answer lies in the extraordinary true story of how Prince George came forward in the Royal Review 2026, and how his courage would inspire his grandfather to champion service and duty in ways the monarchy had never imagined possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked slowly toward his grandfather's private study. At 11 years old, he already carried himself with the careful posture that had been drilled into him since he could walk, but today something was different. Today, his steps held a purpose that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with the letter folded carefully in his jacket pocket. King Charles III sat behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of documents that would soon become the foundation of the most ambitious royal initiative in modern history. The Royal Review 2026 had been his vision for months, a comprehensive examination of how the monarchy could better serve the British people in an era of unprecedented global change. But, as he looked up to see his eldest grandson approaching, Charles had no idea that the most important contribution to his review would come from the last person anyone would expect. "Grandfather," George began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, "I've been thinking about the Royal Review, and I have something I need to share with you." Charles set down his pen and gave George his full attention. Over the past year, he had watched his grandson struggle with questions that most children never had to face. How do you grow up knowing that millions of people will one day look to you for leadership? How do you balance the weight of tradition with the need for change? How do you serve your country when you're still learning to serve yourself? The king had been asking himself similar questions for decades, but seeing them reflected in his grandson's young eyes had given them new urgency. The Royal Review 2026 wasn't just about modernizing the monarchy, it was about ensuring that future generations of royals could find meaning and purpose in their unique position. George pulled the letter from his pocket and placed it carefully on the desk between them. "I wrote this after our conversation last month about what it means to be royal in the 21st century. I've been thinking about all the things you taught me about service and duty, but also about what I see happening in the world around us." Charles picked up the letter, noting the careful handwriting and the official letterhead that George had somehow acquired from the castle's administrative offices. As he began to read, his eyebrows rose in surprise. This wasn't the simple thank you note or childish request he might have expected. This was a thoughtful, articulate proposal that demonstrated a level of insight that would have impressed him coming from someone 3 times George's age. The letter outlined George's observations about the disconnect between the royal family's public image and the real challenges facing ordinary British families. He wrote about conversations he'd overheard between his parents about the cost of living crisis, about charity visits where he'd seen families struggling to heat their homes, about young people his own age who felt like their voices didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But, more than that, the letter contained a proposal. George wanted to be part of the Royal Review 2026, not as a symbolic figure or photo opportunity, but as a genuine contributor. He suggested creating a youth council that would work alongside the traditional royal advisors, bringing fresh perspectives to age-old problems. He proposed visiting schools and youth centers not just for ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but for real conversations about what young people needed from their institutions. most remarkably, he asked to be given real responsibilities, age-appropriate ones, but meaningful nonetheless. He wanted to help plan community service projects, to sit in on meetings about charitable initiatives, to learn firsthand how the monarchy's resources could be used to make a tangible difference in people's lives. As Charles finished reading, he felt a mixture of pride and amazement. His grandson had articulated thoughts and ideas that the king himself had been struggling to express. More importantly, George had shown that he understood the fundamental challenge facing the modern monarchy: how to remain relevant and valuable in a world that increasingly questioned the need for hereditary privilege. "George," Charles said finally, looking up from the letter, "this is extraordinary. But, I have to ask, are you sure you understand what you're proposing? Being part of the Royal Review means taking on real responsibility. It means being accountable for the ideas and initiatives you help create. It means facing criticism from people who might think you're too young or too privileged to understand real problems." George nodded solemnly. "I know, grandfather. But, isn't that exactly why I should be involved? If the monarchy is going to survive and thrive for my generation and beyond, shouldn't my generation have a say in shaping it? Shouldn't we be learning to serve while we're young enough to really understand what service means?" The wisdom in his grandson's words struck Charles with unexpected force. For all his years of experience and careful consideration, he had been approaching the Royal Review from the perspective of someone trying to preserve and modify an existing institution. George was approaching it from the perspective of someone who would have to live with the consequences of those modifications for the rest of his life. Over the following weeks, Charles began quietly incorporating George into the early planning stages of the Royal Review. It started small, having George sit in on briefing meetings, asking for his input on proposed community outreach programs, involving him in discussions about how the royal family could better connect with younger demographics. But George's involvement quickly proved to be more than symbolic. His questions were sharp and insightful, cutting through layers of tradition and protocol to focus on practical outcomes. When advisors proposed a new youth mentorship program, George asked how they would measure its success beyond simple participation numbers. When discussing charity partnerships, he suggested focusing on organizations that empowered young people to create change in their own communities rather than simply providing aid. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Charles found himself seeing familiar problems through entirely new eyes. George's presence in these discussions didn't just add a youthful perspective, it forced everyone to think more clearly about the actual impact of their proposed initiatives. Meanwhile, news of George's involvement began to spread through the castle's network of staff and advisors. Some were skeptical, questioning whether an 11-year-old could meaningfully contribute to such complex discussions about governance and public service. Others were intrigued by the unprecedented nature of a royal child being given such responsibility. Catherine and William watched their son's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. They had always known George was mature for his age, but seeing him engage with issues of national importance was both thrilling and sobering. Were they pushing him to grow up too fast? Or were they finally giving him the tools he would need to fulfill his destiny with confidence and purpose? The answer came during a particularly challenging planning session in late February. The Royal Review team was struggling with how to address criticism that the monarchy was out of touch with the economic realities facing ordinary families. Various proposals had been discussed and discarded, they either seemed too superficial or too politically charged. George had been listening quietly for nearly an hour when he finally spoke up. "What if we started by admitting that we don't really know what it's like to worry about paying for groceries or heating bills? What if instead of pretending we understand these problems, we committed to learning about them by working alongside organizations that deal with them every day?" The room fell silent as everyone processed this simple but profound suggestion. It wasn't revolutionary in concept, but it represented a fundamental shift in approach. Instead of the royal family positioning themselves as benefactors dispensing help from above, George was suggesting they position themselves as students and partners, learning from the very people they hope to serve. "We could create partnerships with food banks, housing charities, job training programs," George continued, his confidence growing as he saw the interested expressions around the room. "Not just to write checks or make appearances, but to actually understand how these organizations work and what they need to be more effective. We could use our platform to amplify their voices rather than just adding our own voices to the conversation." Charles looked around the room and saw nods of approval from even the most traditional advisors. His grandson had just articulated a vision for royal service that was both practical and profound. It acknowledged the limitations of royal privilege while finding ways to use that privilege constructively. It emphasized learning over lecturing, partnership over patronage. As the meeting concluded and the advisors filed out, Charles asked George to stay behind. Grandfather and grandson sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the significance of what had just happened. "You know," Charles said finally, "when I was your age, I was already thinking about what kind of king I wanted to be someday. But I never imagined that my preparation for that role would involve learning from my grandson." George smiled, but his expression remained serious. "Maybe that's what the Royal Review is really about, grandfather. Maybe it's not just about changing how the monarchy serves the people. Maybe it's about changing how we learn to serve, period." As they walked together through the castle's ancient corridors, both Charles and George understood that they had just taken the first steps on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about royal duty. The Royal Review 2026 was no longer just a reform initiative, it was becoming a transformation of the very concept of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. The letter that had started it all remained on Charles's desk, but its words had already begun to reshape the future of the British monarchy. And, at the center of that transformation was an 11-year-old prince who had dared to suggest that true service begins with the courage to admit what you don't know and the humility to learn from those you hope to serve. The announcement came on a gray Tuesday morning in March, delivered through the official royal channels with the kind of careful language that had been crafted over weeks of delicate negotiation. Prince George would be participating in select aspects of the Royal Review 2026, working alongside established advisors to bring a youth perspective to the monarchy's modernization efforts. The press release was measured and diplomatic, but the reaction it provoked was anything but. Within hours, news outlets across Britain were running headlines that ranged from royal revolutionary to too young to rule. Social media exploded with debate about whether an 11-year-old had any business influencing matters of national importance. Conservative commentators worried about the precedent being set, while progressive voices celebrated what they saw as a long overdue acknowledgement that young people deserved a voice in shaping their future. But perhaps the most intense reactions came from within the royal establishment itself. For centuries, the British monarchy had operated according to strict protocols that determined when and how royal children would be introduced to their future responsibilities. George's involvement in the Royal Review shattered those traditions, and not everyone was comfortable with the implications. Lady Pemberton, a longtime palace advisor who had served 3 monarchs, requested an urgent meeting with King Charles. Her concerns were shared by several other senior advisors who worried that involving George so directly in policy discussions would expose him to criticism and pressure that no child should have to bear. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of institutional knowledge, "I understand the impulse to include Prince George in these discussions, but we must consider the broader implications. The monarchy's stability has always depended on maintaining certain boundaries between public and private life, between adult responsibilities and childhood development. Are we prepared for the scrutiny that will inevitably follow?" Charles had anticipated these concerns, but hearing them articulated so directly forced him to examine his own motivations. Was he involving George because it genuinely served the Royal Review's purposes, or because he was trying to prepare his grandson for burdens that were still years away? Was he protecting the institution or potentially damaging it? The answer came from an unexpected source. George himself had been following the public reaction to his involvement with the careful attention of someone who understood that his actions would be scrutinized far beyond the normal bounds of childhood mistakes. Rather than being intimidated by the criticism, he seemed energized by the opportunity to prove his critics wrong. "I know people think I'm too young to understand these issues," he told his grandfather during one of their weekly strategy meetings. "But isn't that exactly the point? If we're trying to make the monarchy more relevant for young people, shouldn't young people have a say in how that happens? And if we wait until I'm older to start learning about these responsibilities, won't it be too late to really understand them?" The logic was compelling, but Charles knew that logic alone wouldn't be enough to address the legitimate concerns being raised by his advisors and the public. George's involvement needed to demonstrate clear value, not just symbolic significance. It needed to produce results that justified the risk of departing from established protocols. The opportunity to prove that value came sooner than anyone expected. One of the Royal Review's priority initiatives involved addressing youth unemployment and educational inequality issues that traditional royal approaches had struggled to tackle effectively. Previous royal involvement had typically consisted of high-profile visits to successful programs and the establishment of new charitable foundations. While well-intentioned, these efforts often felt disconnected from the real experiences of young people facing educational and economic challenges. George proposed a different approach. Instead of starting with solutions, why not start by truly understanding the problems? He suggested that he and a small team of advisors spend time in schools, youth centers, and community organizations across Britain, not as royal visitors but as learners. They would attend classes, participate in job training programs, and sit in on support group meetings. They would ask questions, listen to answers, and try to understand the educational system from the perspective of the students navigating it. The proposal was unprecedented. Royal family members had certainly visited educational institutions before, but always in carefully controlled circumstances designed to showcase success stories and celebrate achievements. George was proposing something far messier and more unpredictable: real engagement with the struggles and frustrations that most royal visits carefully avoided. Palace security was initially horrified by the implications. How could they protect the prince in uncontrolled environments? How could they manage media access without turning every interaction into a staged photo opportunity? How could they ensure that George's presence didn't disrupt the very programs they were trying to understand? But Charles recognized that these challenges were exactly what made George's proposal so valuable. If the Royal Review was going to produce meaningful change, it needed to grapple with real problems in their natural contexts. Sanitized royal visits might generate positive headlines, but they wouldn't generate the deep understanding necessary for effective action. The compromise that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. George would indeed visit schools and youth programs, but under carefully negotiated conditions. Media access would be limited to brief, controlled sessions at the end of each visit. Security would be present but unobtrusive. Most importantly, George would be accompanied by experienced youth workers and educators who could help him process what he was learning and ensure that his presence added value rather than creating disruption. The first visit was to a comprehensive school in Birmingham that served a diverse community facing significant economic challenges. George spent a full day attending regular classes, eating lunch in the cafeteria, and participating in after-school programs. He wasn't introduced as a prince. Students and teachers knew who he was, but he was simply referred to as George, a young visitor who was interested in learning about their school. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Without the formal structure of a royal visit, conversations were more natural and honest. Students shared frustrations about overcrowded classrooms, outdated equipment, and limited opportunities for extracurricular activities. Teachers talked openly about budget constraints and the challenges of providing individual attention to students with diverse needs. But, more importantly, George's presence seemed to energize rather than intimidate the people he met. His genuine curiosity and thoughtful questions demonstrated that he was there to learn, not to judge. His own experiences of academic pressure and social expectations created unexpected common ground with students who might have assumed that royal privilege meant royal disconnection. During a particularly powerful moment in a careers counseling session, a 16-year-old named Marcus expressed frustration about the gap between his academic aspirations and his family's financial reality. "I want to study engineering," he said, "but I know I'll probably need to leave school at 16 to help support my family. It feels like there's no point in dreaming about things I can't afford." George listened carefully, then asked a simple but profound question: what would need to change for you to be able to pursue engineering while still supporting your family? Not just more money, but what specific barriers would need to be removed? The question sparked a discussion that continued for the rest of the session and beyond. Students began identifying concrete obstacles: the cost of university preparation courses, the lack of paid apprenticeship programs that combined education with income, the limited availability of evening and weekend classes that would allow them to work while studying. These weren't abstract policy issues, they were specific, solvable problems that existing royal charitable initiatives had never directly addressed. By the end of the day, George had filled several pages of his notebook with observations and ideas. But, more importantly, he had begun to understand the difference between charity and empowerment, between helping people and enabling them to help themselves. The impact of the visit extended far beyond George's personal education. The school staff were energized by having their challenges heard and understood by someone with access to real influence. Students felt valued and validated in ways that traditional royal visits had never achieved. And the community began to see the Royal Review not as another top-down initiative, but as a genuine effort to build connections and create change from the ground up. Word of George's approach spread quickly through royal circles and beyond. The traditional model of royal engagement, brief visits, prepared speeches, carefully stage-managed interactions, suddenly seemed outdated and insufficient. George had demonstrated that authentic engagement was not only possible but far more powerful than the alternatives. Over the following weeks, similar visits were arranged to youth centres in Manchester, job training programs in Cardiff, and community colleges in Edinburgh. Each experience deepened George's understanding of the challenges facing young people across Britain, but also revealed opportunities for meaningful intervention that had previously been invisible to royal planners. The transformation in George himself was remarkable to witness. The careful, protocol-conscious prince who had first approached his grandfather with a letter had evolved into a confident, engaged advocate for the young people he was meeting. He still maintained his royal deportment, but his conversations were now informed by real experiences and genuine relationships. Perhaps most importantly, George's involvement was beginning to transform the Royal Review itself. What had started as an institutional reform initiative was becoming something far more fundamental, a redefinition of what royal service could and should look like in the modern world. Instead of the traditional model of royal patronage, with its emphasis on charitable giving and symbolic support, a new model was emerging that emphasized learning, partnership, and collaborative problem-solving. The critics who had initially dismissed George's involvement as a publicity stunt were forced to acknowledge the substance of what he was achieving. The youth unemployment proposals that emerged from his school visits were detailed, practical, and directly informed by the experiences of young people facing these challenges. The educational inequality initiatives he helped develop were grounded in real classroom observations and teacher insights rather than abstract policy theories. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the royal family itself was beginning to understand its role. Charles watched his grandson's transformation with growing admiration and occasional amazement. George had shown that royal privilege could be used not just to support good causes, but to create genuine understanding and meaningful change. He had proven that youth and experience could be complementary rather than contradictory, and that fresh perspectives could enhance rather than threaten institutional wisdom. As spring turned toward summer, the Royal Review 2026 was no longer just King Charles's initiative with George's input. It had become a genuine collaboration between grandfather and grandson, tradition and innovation, institutional knowledge and fresh insight. And, at its center was the revolutionary idea that true royal service required not just good intentions and generous resources, but the humility to learn from the very people the monarchy hoped to serve. The protocol that George had broken wasn't just about age or procedure, it was about the fundamental relationship between the royal family and the British people. And, in breaking that protocol, he had opened the door to something far more valuable than what had been lost. By June 2026, Prince George's involvement in the Royal Review had captured the imagination of people far beyond Britain's borders. International media outlets were running feature stories about the People's Prince and his unprecedented approach to royal duty. Documentary filmmakers were requesting access to follow his community visits. Political analysts were debating whether George's model of engaged monarchy could influence how other hereditary institutions approached their roles in democratic societies. But the real measure of George's impact wasn't in the global headlines, it was in the quiet transformations happening in communities across Britain where his visits had sparked ongoing change. The comprehensive school in Birmingham had used insights from George's visit to develop a new partnership program with local engineering firms, creating paid apprenticeships that allowed students like Marcus to pursue higher education while earning income. Youth centres in Manchester had redesigned their career counselling services based on conversations that had emerged during George's time there. Community colleges throughout Scotland were piloting new evening education programs that George had helped design. These weren't one-off charitable donations or royal grants that would eventually run out. They were systemic changes that addressed root causes rather than symptoms, sustainable initiatives that would continue generating benefits long after the royal attention had moved elsewhere. The difference was profound, and it was starting to influence how other members of the royal family approached their own charitable and public service responsibilities. Catherine and William found themselves fielding questions about whether their other children would follow George's example when they came of age. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge had initially been cautious about their eldest son's involvement in the royal review, worried about the pressure and scrutiny he would face. But, seeing the positive impact of his work, and, more importantly, seeing how much George himself was growing and thriving in the role, their perspective had shifted dramatically. "We always knew George would have to learn to carry significant responsibility," Catherine explained during a rare television interview about the royal review. "What we hadn't anticipated was how much he would teach us about what that responsibility could look like. He's shown us that service doesn't have to wait until you're older and more experienced. In many ways, his youth has been his greatest asset. He approaches problems without the assumptions and limitations that adults often carry." William's perspective was equally transformed. As someone who had spent his adult life trying to balance royal duty with personal authenticity, he was amazed to watch his son navigate these challenges with such apparent ease. "George has found a way to be fully himself while also being fully royal," William observed. "He hasn't had to choose between being a normal kid and being a future king. He's shown us that those roles can actually complement each other." The success of George's approach was creating ripple effects throughout the royal establishment. Younger members of the extended royal family were requesting more meaningful roles in their charitable work. Long-established royal patronages were being re-examined to ensure they created genuine impact rather than just positive publicity. The entire institution was being forced to confront questions about purpose and effectiveness that it had largely avoided for generations. But, perhaps the most significant change was in how ordinary British citizens were beginning to relate to the monarchy. Public opinion polls showed that support for the royal family among young people had increased dramatically since George's involvement in the royal review became public knowledge. More importantly, these weren't just approval ratings, they reflected a genuine engagement with the monarchy as an institution that could contribute to solving real problems. 16-year-old Sarah Henderson from Liverpool became an unexpected symbol of this new relationship when she started a petition calling for young people to be included in local government decision-making processes. Her inspiration came directly from watching George's community visits and realizing that age didn't have to be a barrier to meaningful participation in public life. "If Prince George can help design education policy at 11 years old, why can't I have a voice in decisions that affect my community?" she wrote in the petition description. "He's shown us that young people can offer valuable perspectives on problems that adults have been struggling with for years. We don't want to wait until we're older to start making a difference." The petition gathered over 100,000 signatures within 2 weeks and prompted several local councils to establish youth advisory committees. More importantly, it demonstrated that George's impact was extending beyond direct royal initiatives to inspire broader civic engagement among young people who had previously felt excluded from political and social decision-making processes. This groundswell of youth activism caught the attention of political leaders across the spectrum. The Prime Minister invited George to participate in a roundtable discussion about youth policy initiatives, marking the first time in modern history that a member of the royal family under the age of 18 had been directly consulted on matters of government policy. The opposition leaders followed suit, recognizing that George's involvement had created new opportunities for bipartisan collaboration on issues affecting young people. The roundtable session was held at Downing Street on a warm July afternoon, with participants including the Prime Minister, several cabinet ministers, opposition MPs, and representatives from youth organizations across Britain. George arrived with a folder full of notes from his community visits and a clear agenda focused on the practical barriers that prevented young people from accessing education and employment opportunities. The discussion that followed was unlike any political meeting the participants had previously experienced. George's questions were direct and informed, cutting through partisan rhetoric to focus on practical solutions. When ministers attempted to deflect difficult questions with political talking points, George's follow-up questions forced them to address the real-world implications of their policies. "Minister," George said at one point, addressing the education secretary, "you mentioned increased funding for schools, but the teachers I've spoken with say the money comes with so many restrictions that they can't use it to address their most pressing needs. Have you considered giving schools more flexibility in how they spend their allocations?" The question was polite but pointed, and it sparked a discussion about educational bureaucracy that continued for over an hour. Similar exchanges occurred throughout the session, with George's community-based insights challenging assumptions and prompting new thinking about long-standing policy challenges. By the end of the meeting, several concrete initiatives had emerged. A new program would provide direct funding to schools for locally identified priorities. Youth employment services would be redesigned based on feedback from the young people they were meant to serve. Most significantly, a permanent youth advisory council would be established to provide ongoing input on policies affecting young people. The success of the roundtable session had profound implications for both the monarchy and British politics more broadly. George had demonstrated that royal engagement could enhance rather than complicate democratic processes, providing a nonpartisan platform for addressing issues that transcended traditional political boundaries. He had shown that the monarchy's traditional role as a unifying institution could evolve to include active facilitation of positive social change. But the impact extended beyond policy outcomes. The image of an 11-year-old prince sitting at the same table as seasoned politicians and holding his own in substantive policy discussions captured the public imagination in ways that traditional royal activities never had. Here was proof that the monarchy could be both ceremonial and practical, traditional and innovative, symbolic and effective. International observers were taking notice as well. Royal families across Europe were sending delegations to study Britain's Royal Review initiative. Commonwealth nations were exploring how similar models might be adapted to their own contexts. Academic institutions were beginning to offer courses on the George model of civic engagement, examining how his approach could be applied beyond royal contexts. The attention was gratifying, but it also brought new pressures. George found himself managing a packed schedule of community visits, policy meetings, and media engagements while still maintaining his regular education and trying to preserve some semblance of normal childhood experiences. The balance wasn't always easy to maintain, and there were moments when the weight of public expectation felt overwhelming. During one particularly challenging week in late July, when media coverage of his activities had reached fever pitch and critics were questioning whether his education was suffering from his public commitments, George approached his grandfather with concerns about the sustainability of his current pace. "I want to continue with the Royal Review work," he told Charles during a private conversation in the castle gardens, "but I'm worried that I'm becoming more of a celebrity than a contributor. The attention is starting to overshadow the actual work we're doing." Charles recognized the wisdom in his grandson's observation. The success of George's involvement had created its own challenges, and maintaining the focus on substance rather than spectacle would require careful management. Together, they developed new protocols that would allow George to continue his meaningful contributions while protecting his privacy and educational development. The solution involved stepping back from the most high-profile aspects of his role while deepening his involvement in the substantive work that had made the greatest impact. Instead of frequent public appearances and media interviews, George would focus on longer-term projects that could be developed away from public scrutiny. The community partnerships he had helped establish would continue their work with less royal visibility but more sustainable royal support. This recalibration actually enhanced rather than diminished George's effectiveness. Freed from the pressure of constant public attention, he was able to develop deeper relationships with the organizations and communities he was working with. His insights became more nuanced and his recommendations more sophisticated as he gained experience and confidence in his role. The evolution of George's involvement reflected a broader maturation of the Royal Review initiative itself. What had begun as an ambitious but somewhat abstract modernization effort had become a concrete demonstration of how the monarchy could contribute to addressing real social challenges. The success wasn't measured in media coverage or public approval ratings, but in the measurable improvements in the lives of young people across Britain. As summer drew to a close, Charles reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred since his grandson had first approached him with a handwritten letter. The Royal Review 2026 had exceeded his most optimistic expectations, not because it had generated positive publicity for the monarchy, but because it had proven that the institution could evolve to meet the needs of a changing society while maintaining its essential character and values. The young prince who had once worried about the weight of a future crown was now helping to reshape what that crown could represent. And, in doing so, he was proving that the British monarchy's greatest strength lay not in its traditions and protocols, but in its capacity to serve the people with humility, authenticity, and genuine care for their welfare. The nation that was watching George's journey wasn't just observing the development of a future king, they were witnessing the birth of a new model of public service that could inspire change far beyond the boundaries of royal responsibility. And, at the center of it all was an 11-year-old boy who had dared to suggest that true leadership begins with the courage to learn from those you hope to serve. September 2026 brought with it the kind of crisp autumn air that seemed to energize everyone at Windsor Castle, but this year the energy felt different, charged with possibility and purpose in ways that even the most optimistic observers of the Royal Review hadn't anticipated. Prince George's approach to royal service had not only transformed his own understanding of his future role, but had sparked a revolution in how the entire monarchy approached its relationship with the British people. The changes were visible everywhere. Princess Charlotte, now 8 years old, had begun expressing interest in environmental initiatives after watching her brother's community engagement work. She had started asking pointed questions about the royal household's sustainability practices and had proposed several changes to reduce waste at family residences. Prince Louis, still only 5, had surprised everyone by asking if he could visit local animal shelters like George visits schools, demonstrating that even the youngest royals were absorbing new models of public service. But the most significant transformations were occurring beyond the immediate royal family. The Royal Review had evolved from a single initiative into a comprehensive reimagining of how the monarchy could contribute to national life. Traditional royal patronages were being restructured to emphasize active collaboration rather than ceremonial support. Charitable giving was being redesigned to focus on sustainable solutions rather than temporary relief. Most importantly, the entire approach to royal public engagement was shifting from symbolic appearances to substantive partnerships. The model that George had pioneered, deep listening, authentic learning, and collaborative problem-solving, was being adapted and implemented across the full spectrum of royal activities. When Princess Anne visited a veterans support center in Newcastle, she spent 2 days working alongside counselors and administrators to understand the real challenges facing former service members. When the Earl of Wessex toured manufacturing facilities in the Midlands, he participated in training programs and strategy sessions rather than simply cutting ribbons and posing for photographs. Each of these engagements was producing the same kind of concrete results that George's community visits had generated. The Veterans Center developed new peer support programs based on insights from Princess Anne's visit. The manufacturing facilities launched apprenticeship initiatives that addressed workforce development challenges identified during the Earl's extended engagement. The pattern was clear: authentic royal involvement was catalyzing positive change in ways that traditional royal activities never had. This transformation wasn't happening in isolation. The success of the Royal Review was inspiring similar innovations in other areas of British public life. Local government officials were adopting George's model of community consultation, spending time in neighborhoods and schools before developing policy initiatives. Business leaders were implementing new approaches to corporate social responsibility that emphasized learning from community partners rather than simply funding charitable causes. University researchers were redesigning their community engagement practices to ensure that their work addressed real rather than perceived needs. The ripple effects extended into unexpected areas. The National Health Service began piloting new patient consultation processes inspired by George's approach to listening to young people's concerns about educational barriers. Housing associations started involving residents in design and planning processes for community development projects. Even utility companies were experimenting with more collaborative approaches to customer service and community relations. But perhaps the most profound changes were occurring in how young people across Britain understood their own potential for civic engagement. Youth organizations reported dramatic increases in volunteer participation and community leadership applications. Student councils were being revitalized as young people realized that their voices could influence real change. Voter registration among 18-year-olds reached record highs as young people who had been inspired by George's example prepared to exercise their democratic rights. Emma Richardson, a 17-year-old from Sheffield, exemplified this new generation of civic engagement. Inspired by George's education advocacy work, she had researched the challenges facing students with learning disabilities in her local school district and developed a comprehensive proposal for improved support services. Rather than simply submitting her ideas to school administrators, she had followed George's model of collaborative problem-solving, working with teachers, parents, and students to refine her proposals and build support for implementation. Prince George showed us that you don't have to wait for permission to make a difference, Emma explained during a regional youth leadership conference. You don't have to be an adult or an expert to identify problems and contribute to solutions. You just have to be willing to listen, learn, and work with other people who care about the same issues. Emma's initiative had succeeded in transforming learning disability support services across her entire school district, and her model was being adopted by student advocates in other regions. Her success story was one of hundreds that were emerging across Britain as young people embraced their capacity for meaningful civic participation. The international attention that George's work had attracted was also producing unexpected dividends. The Commonwealth Youth Council had invited George to address their annual meeting in October, creating an opportunity for him to share his insights with young leaders from across the Commonwealth. European youth organizations were requesting similar presentations, recognizing that George's approach to civic engagement transcended national boundaries and royal contexts. More significantly, several Commonwealth nations were exploring how similar initiatives could be adapted to their own political and social contexts. Canada was piloting a youth consultation program inspired by George's community visits. Australia was experimenting with new approaches to Indigenous community engagement based on the collaborative model that the Royal Review had pioneered. New Zealand was redesigning its youth development programs to emphasize practical problem-solving over traditional charity models. The success of these international adaptations validated what Charles had begun to suspect, that George's contribution to the Royal Review represented something larger than royal reform or even British social innovation. It represented a fundamental shift in how societies could approach the challenge of engaging young people in meaningful participation in civic life. This realization prompted Charles to propose something unprecedented: an international conference on youth civic engagement that would bring together young leaders, policymakers, and civic organizations from around the world to explore how George's model could be adapted and expanded across different cultural and political contexts. The proposal was enthusiastically endorsed by Commonwealth leaders and attracted interest from youth organizations and government agencies across Europe, North America, and beyond. Planning for the International Youth Civic Engagement Conference became a major focus for George during the autumn months. Working with organizers from multiple countries and organizations, he helped design an event that would emphasize practical collaboration over ceremonial presentations. Instead of traditional conference sessions with expert speakers addressing passive audiences, the event would feature working groups where participants would collaborate on real challenges facing their communities and countries. George's role in the conference planning process demonstrated how much his understanding of leadership and civic engagement had evolved over the course of the Royal Review. He approached the task not as a royal patron lending his name to someone else's initiative, but as a genuine partner contributing substantive ideas and practical insights based on his community engagement experiences. The planning sessions were intense and sometimes challenging. Participants from different countries brought different perspectives on youth civic engagement, and finding common ground wasn't always easy. Some emphasized formal political participation through voting and party politics. Others focused on community service and volunteer activism. Still others prioritized social entrepreneurship and innovation as paths to civic impact. George's contribution was to help the group recognize that these different approaches weren't competing alternatives but complementary strategies that could reinforce each other. His community visit experiences had shown him that effective civic engagement often required combining formal political advocacy with grassroots community work and innovative problem-solving approaches. Maybe the question isn't which approach to civic engagement is most effective, George suggested during one particularly productive planning session. Maybe the question is how we can help young people develop skills and confidence in multiple approaches so they can choose the right tools for the specific challenges they want to address. This insight became a central organizing principle for the conference, which was designed to expose participants to multiple models of civic engagement while providing practical experience in collaborative problem solving. The event would feature working groups focused on education, employment, environmental sustainability, social justice, and community development, with participants from different countries collaborating to develop solutions that could be adapted to their local contexts. As November approached and the conference date drew near, excitement was building not just among the participants but throughout the broader community of people who had been following George's work. The conference represented a culmination of the Royal Review's evolution from a royal modernization initiative to a catalyst for international innovation in youth civic engagement. But, even as preparations intensified, George remained focused on the local community work that had been the foundation of his involvement in the Royal Review. His autumn visits to schools and youth centers continued to generate new insights and initiatives. A visit to a technical college in Liverpool resulted in a new partnership between the college and local manufacturing companies that would provide paid apprenticeships for students studying engineering and skilled trades. A session with youth workers in Bristol led to the development of new mentorship programs that paired older and younger participants in ways that built leadership skills for both groups. These ongoing community connections were crucial for George's continued development as a civic leader. They kept him grounded in the real challenges facing young people while also providing him with fresh insights that he could share with international partners. The combination of local engagement and global perspective was proving to be extraordinarily powerful, enabling George to contribute to solutions that were both practically grounded and broadly applicable. As autumn deepened into winter, the full scope of the transformation that had begun with George's handwritten letter to his grandfather became increasingly clear. The Royal Review 2026 had evolved far beyond its original scope to become a model for how established institutions could adapt to serve changing social needs while maintaining their core values and identity. George's role in that transformation had evolved as well, from an eager young contributor to a confident civic leader whose insights and approach were influencing positive change across multiple countries and contexts. The ripple effects of his work were spreading in directions that no one could have predicted when he first approached King Charles with his proposal for youth involvement in the Royal Review. And, as the International Youth Civic Engagement Conference prepared to convene, it was becoming clear that those ripple effects were just the beginning of something much larger and more significant than anyone had dared to imagine. December 2026 arrived with a sense of completion and anticipation that permeated every corner of Windsor Castle. The International Youth Civic Engagement Conference was scheduled for mid-month, bringing together 200 young leaders from 53 countries to collaborate on solutions to challenges that transcended national boundaries. But, as significant as the conference would be, everyone understood that it represented not an end but a beginning, the launching point for a global movement that had its origins in a handwritten letter from an 11-year-old prince to his grandfather. The year-end Royal Review assessment painted a picture of transformation that exceeded even the most optimistic projections from January. Youth unemployment in communities where George had conducted visits had decreased by an average of 15%, with the improvements directly traceable to programs and partnerships that had emerged from his engagement work. Educational outcomes in participating schools showed marked improvements across multiple measures, from attendance rates to university application numbers to student satisfaction surveys. But, the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The qualitative changes were equally significant and, perhaps more lasting. Teachers reported that students were more engaged in their learning and more confident about their ability to influence positive change in their communities. Community leaders spoke of new energy and optimism in neighborhoods that had struggled with economic and social challenges for decades. Young people across Britain were demonstrating levels of civic engagement and leadership that hadn't been seen in generations. Perhaps most remarkably, the transformation had occurred without compromising the essential character of the monarchy itself. If anything, the Royal Review had strengthened the institution by demonstrating its capacity to evolve and remain relevant in changing circumstances. Public approval ratings for the royal family had reached historic highs, but, more importantly, the quality of that approval had changed. Instead of passive respect for tradition, surveys showed active appreciation for the monarchy's contribution to addressing real social challenges. King Charles reflected on these changes as he prepared his remarks for the conference opening ceremony. The initiative that had begun as an effort to modernize royal protocols had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that established institutions could serve as catalysts for positive social change when they approached their responsibilities with humility, authenticity, and genuine commitment to serving others. A year ago, Charles would tell the conference participants, "My grandson taught me that true leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about asking the right questions and having the courage to learn from the people you hope to serve." The Royal Review began as an effort to improve how the monarchy serves the British people, but it has become something larger, a model for how any institution, organization, or individual can contribute to positive change by listening deeply, learning continuously, and collaborating authentically. The words captured the essence of what George had accomplished, but they also reflected the broader significance of his achievement. By demonstrating that authentic engagement could produce meaningful results, he had inspired countless others to attempt similar approaches in their own contexts. The ripple effects of his work were now visible in communities, organizations, and institutions across multiple continents. The conference itself was a testament to this global impact. Participants included student council presidents from Canadian high schools, community organizers from South African townships, environmental activists from Pacific Island nations, and youth entrepreneurs from Eastern European cities. Despite their diverse backgrounds and contexts, they shared a common commitment to collaborative problem-solving and community-centered approaches to social change. The working group sessions that formed the conference's core programming were structured around real challenges identified by the participants themselves. Instead of abstract policy discussions or theoretical presentations, the groups focused on developing practical solutions to specific problems affecting young people in their home communities. George participated as a full member rather than a ceremonial leader, contributing insights from his Royal Review experiences while learning from the expertise and perspectives of his international colleagues. The Education Working Group, which George joined, included participants from 12 countries who were grappling with various aspects of educational inequality and youth development challenges. The diversity of contexts was striking: rural school districts in Montana facing teacher shortages, urban schools in Mumbai struggling with overcrowding, indigenous communities in Australia seeking culturally appropriate curriculum development, refugee settlements in Jordan working to provide educational opportunities for displaced populations. But, despite these different contexts, common themes emerged quickly. Young people everywhere were seeking educational experiences that prepared them for meaningful participation in their communities and economies. They wanted learning opportunities that connected academic knowledge with real-world problem-solving. They needed support systems that recognized their capacity for leadership and contribution rather than simply their need for guidance and protection. Working together over several intensive days, the group developed a comprehensive framework for community-centered educational partnerships that could be adapted to different cultural and economic contexts. The framework emphasized collaboration between educational institutions and community organizations, student participation in curriculum development and program evaluation, and integration of civic engagement opportunities into regular academic programming. The framework was practical and detailed, including implementation guides, assessment tools, and resource-sharing protocols. But, more importantly, it was infused with the collaborative spirit and authentic engagement approach that George had pioneered through the Royal Review. Each component emphasized listening, learning, and partnership rather than top-down reform or expert-driven solutions. Similar innovations emerged from the other working groups. The Employment Initiative developed new models for youth entrepreneurship that emphasized community benefit alongside individual success. The Environmental Sustainability Group created frameworks for youth-led environmental advocacy that integrated scientific learning with practical conservation action. The Social Justice Working Group designed peer mediation and restorative justice programs that could be implemented in schools and communities worldwide. As the conference drew to a close, participants were energized but also somewhat overwhelmed by the scope of what they had accomplished together. They had created not just individual programs or initiatives, but a comprehensive approach to youth civic engagement that could transform how societies supported young people's development as engaged citizens and effective leaders. The closing ceremony featured presentations from each working group, but the real significance of the event lay in the networks and partnerships that had formed among the participants. Exchange programs were being planned that would allow young leaders to learn from successful initiatives in other countries. Resource sharing agreements were being developed to support implementation of the frameworks and tools that had emerged from the working sessions. Most importantly, ongoing communication and collaboration structures were being established to ensure that the innovation and energy generated during the conference would continue long after the participants returned to their home communities. George's role in the closing ceremony was both ceremonial and substantive. As the conference host and the person whose work had inspired the gathering, he delivered remarks that reflected on what had been accomplished and what lay ahead. But his words also demonstrated how much his own understanding of leadership and civic engagement had evolved over the course of the year. When I first wrote to my grandfather about the Royal Review, he told the assembled participants, I thought I was proposing ways to make the monarchy more relevant and effective. I didn't realize I was beginning a conversation about how all of us can contribute to positive change in our communities and our world. This week has shown me that the approach we developed through the Royal Review, listening deeply, learning continuously, and collaborating authentically, isn't just a strategy for royal engagement. It's a foundation for any kind of leadership that hopes to make a meaningful difference. The applause that followed was lengthy and heartfelt, but George's words had resonated for reasons beyond their eloquence or their appropriateness to the occasion. They captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred not just in George's own understanding of his role, but in how institutions and individuals across multiple countries were beginning to approach their civic responsibilities. As participants prepared to return to their home countries, carrying with them the frameworks, partnerships, and inspiration they had gained during the conference, the full scope of George's achievement became clear. He had done more than modernize royal protocols or improve the monarchy's public image. He had catalyzed a global conversation about how young people could be supported in developing their capacity for civic leadership, and how established institutions could evolve to serve changing social needs while maintaining their essential values and identity. The months that followed the conference brought steady reports of implementation successes across multiple countries and contexts. Canadian schools were piloting community partnership programs based on the education framework. Australian environmental organizations were adapting the youth leadership models for conservation initiatives. South African community centers were implementing peer mediation programs that had emerged from the Social Justice Working Group. But perhaps the most significant validation of George's approach came from an unexpected source. The United Nations Youth Council voted to adopt the collaborative problem-solving model as their standard approach to youth engagement programming. The decision meant that George's insights about authentic participation and community-centered solutions would influence youth development work in countries around the world. As 2026 drew to a close and preparations began for the second annual Royal Review assessment, King Charles found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had begun with his grandson's handwritten letter. The initiative that he had conceived as a modernization effort for the monarchy had become something far larger and, more significant, a catalyst for innovation in youth civic engagement that was inspiring positive change on a global scale. The assessment data that was being compiled painted an impressive picture of concrete accomplishments: decreased unemployment, improved educational outcomes, increased civic participation, enhanced community cohesion. But Charles understood that the most important legacy of the Royal Review wasn't captured in statistics or survey results. It was visible in the confidence and capability of young people like George who had discovered their capacity to contribute to positive change, and in the transformation of institutions and organizations that had learned to approach their responsibilities with greater humility, authenticity, and effectiveness. The boy who had once sat nervously in his grandfather's study, worried about the weight of a future crown, had grown into a confident young leader whose insights and approach were influencing positive change far beyond the boundaries of royal responsibility. More importantly, he had demonstrated that true leadership begins not with authority or expertise, but with the courage to listen deeply, learn continuously, and collaborate authentically with the people you hope to serve. As George continued his community visits and international partnerships into the new year, it was clear that his story was far from over. At 11 years old, he had already accomplished more than most people achieve in a lifetime of public service. But those accomplishments were just the foundation for what promised to be a remarkable journey of continued growth, learning, and contribution to the common good. The legacy he was building wasn't just about transforming the monarchy or even about inspiring youth civic engagement. It was about demonstrating that anyone, regardless of age or position, could contribute to positive change by approaching their responsibilities with genuine care for others and authentic commitment to making a difference. And, in a world facing unprecedented challenges that would require collaborative solutions and innovative approaches, that lesson had never been more important or more urgently needed.